The other day, I made a video on Solstice armor and why it's a great farm, especially for new players, to get high stat armor rolls in order to get triple 100 builds. And a question I got a lot in that video, by the way, thanks for the views, video thumbnail here. I'll leave the link to that video below in case you want to check it out and know everything about armor stats in the game, including exotics as well. But the question I got the most was, what stats should I focus on my build? Warlocks, Titans, Hunters, etc. So this is going to be a follow-up video to that, and giving you guys recommendations on what to focus on if you don't know already. Also, quick disclaimer, this is going to be recommendations for PvE for the most part. I will mention a few scenarios where PvP comes into play, but for the most part, why would you ever subject yourself to that? Jokes aside, PvE player, so recommendations are just going to be mostly for PvE. So let's get into it. Now, first things first, what am I talking about when I say focusing stats? In this particular video, we're talking about what you can do using your Ghost mod, which is in here, to put in any stat that you like. And if you're using Solstice armor, which you should, we're going to be talking about using a Shining Ember to put a spark on your armor as well. AKA, you're going to be targeting 2 stats in any armor piece that you want for Solstice armor to get the stats that you want in particular. So if I want Resilience and Recovery, I use my Ghost plus this to get that. Warlocks, you're up first. Let's get the elephant out of the room immediately. Resilient is always going to be king. Spoiler alert, it's going to be the same thing for Titans and Hunters. It is just too good of a stat to ignore. It is the best stat in the game by a mile, and it reduces your damage taken, so it's basically mandatory in the game. If you don't have 100 Resilience, you're actively trying to sabotage yourself by taking more damage and potentially dying more in activities. So, first high recommendation is absolutely having 100 Resilience. Moving on from that, let's talk about things you don't want. First up, mobility on Warlocks. Completely useless. Don't even bother. Mobility is pretty much a dead stat on Warlocks. The only time you would ever want mobility is if you're a high endgame player, which, if you are, you probably don't even need this video. And there's very, very few niche situations where you would want more mobility to be faster in a particular, like, solo challenge, for example. Outside of that, completely useless. Don't bother. After that, we have strength. Borderline useless as well. However, I will note that this comes in handy if you're a PvP player and you want to rock something like the Cha-Cha Slide for Arc Warlocks, and then have the Stasis Warlock for double melees with the Ahamkara exotic, where you just want to abuse freezing people. But outside of that particular PvP situation, again, strength, basically a useless stat for Warlocks in PvE. Intellect is up next. Now, this one's kind of a toss-up. You can actually have some value into it, and in other situations, you could have no value into it. Really, the reason why I say this is because Intellect has kind of gotten pushed out and power crept out of the equation. It's still a good stat because it gives you your super faster, but there are so many ways to abuse getting your super much quicker in the game without actually using the Intellect stat. It's kind of absurd. What I'm talking about is things like heavy-handed, firepower, hands-on, and Reaper. Basically, you pop a rift, then you get a kill, and thanks to Reaper, you get an orb. And you just keep abusing this to get your super faster, as opposed to just crushing on your Intellect stat. Now, with that being said, it's not completely useless. You can rock Intellect in things like Trials of Osiris, where there's a flag to cap every round, and if you pop a well on the flag, more than often than not, you're going to win that round simply because you popped Well of Radiance on a flag in Trials. There's also other situations like solo challenges in PvE, where you absolutely want to get your super very fast in order to survive certain situations, like a boss damage phase, for example, on a solo flawless run in Ghosts, just to keep you alive, things like that. Finally, the last 2 stats for Warlocks, Discipline and Recovery. I think these are a close second place to Resilience. They're not quite mandatory status, but they are extremely helpful to Warlocks. Discipline in particular because there's tons of builds that revolve around having your grenade used. For example, you have Verity's Brow builds, you have Sunbrazer's builds where your snap goes wrong, Controversial Warlock builds where you weaken enemies and keep your Devour up non-stop, Getaway Artist builds for keeping your Arc Assault buddies up at all times, and then you have Ozymandias for Stasis Warlocks as well. And then you have Recovery, giving you a reduce in cooldown on your class ability, aka your Rift, which you'll be using all the time, and it increases the speed at which you regain your lost health, also super helpful. So all in all, for Warlocks, I would go Resilience, then Discipline, and then Recovery if you can help it in that order. If you play some niche activities in the game, then you could try to spec into Strength and Intellect if you'd like. But overall, I would stick with the top tree for 99% of your builds. Titans, you're up next. Again, Resilience is king. In this case for Titans, Resilience is king for both PvE and PvP. Then we move on to the other stats. Mobility, completely useless dead stat, same as Warlocks. Maybe there's a small niche situation where you would use mobility for Titans, but for the most part, 99% of the time, mobility is a complete dead stat. Never focus on that. Then we move on to Strength. Now, Strength, while I think has very little use in PvE, it could definitely have a lot of value in PvP when the Titan meta is basically spam your barricades and spam your melee all over the place because of movement tech, if you will. So Strength is a value stat for PvP, but if you don't play PvP, good on you, then Strength is pretty much useless for your PvE Titan. For Titans, I think, in my opinion, intellect is pretty much a useless stat currently in the game's meta. You really don't need any of the Titan supers in PvE action in the game, and even if you did, you would just be getting them from the mods that I mentioned earlier for Warlocks, abusal of heavy-handed, firepower, hands-on, etc., and you can get them very quickly for your bubble or your thunder crash, whatever you'd like. The utility for Titans, for the most part, is actually in their other abilities, not supers, so it makes intellect a stat that's not very highly valued, at least in my eyes. Quick little edit, I did want to mention that if you're playing in PvP, and particularly in Trials, then on a Bubble Titan, intellect is 100% worth it because bubbles on cap zones are absolutely stupid. Moving on. And there's tons of examples to show this. For example, Sunbreakers have the bonk build where you use your regular melee and that's literally it, and that is the entire build. Yes, you can follow it up with Hammer of Souls as your super to get some nice beefy damage out or use for survivability, but for the most part, you're going to be bonking enemies to get your extra Roaring Flames and then send them to the Shadow Realm just with your regular melee. And then you have other things like Shield Bash for Void Titans, you have the spam of Suspension and Woven Mail on Strand Titans, but again, you don't need to use your super, it's probably the weakest part of your kit, so intellect, not really highly valued. Now finally we have Recovery and Discipline. I think Recovery is a valued stat for Titans given that you're always going to be trying to be in the face of your opponent in PvE content, especially with something like Bonk Hammer or Woven Mail Titans. So Recovery is helpful in getting your HP back faster or as fast as possible as you can. Meanwhile, Discipline, I think is kind of a toss-up. Grenades on Titans aren't the greatest thing in PvE. Like, they'll never be catered or revolved around the main purpose of your builds. However, in things like Trials, in PvP content, you could abuse things like lightning grenades or double lightning grenades and get your grenades back faster in small spaces, especially when the entire mode is catered around a flag zone now, so you know people will be standing in certain spots. So Discipline has some value, but not quite as much as Warlocks do with their grenades. All in all, Titans, the main two stats you're going to want to have is Resilience and then Recovery after that. Following that, it depends on what kind of activity player you are. If you're a PvP player, you could spec into Strength for allowing you to spam your melee faster in Crucible. And then if you're mostly a PvE player, you can still spec into Discipline because having your grenade for certain situations is still nice. Things like healing grenades, weaken grenades, etc. Last but not least, you have Hunters. Now, Resilience again is going to be king as number one, so we're just going to go ahead and skip that. Then you kind of have a dogfight going on between the other stats. You can go 18 different ways with Hunters. Unlike Titans and Warlocks, you can actually abuse the mobility stat for multiple reasons in this game. For example, you want to pump it up to near max with Hunters in Crucible, because PvP and dodge spamming is a thing, of course. But in PvE, it also has usage as you want to get your dodge back in some builds faster if you happen to lose it. Now, it's worth noting, while I'm sure mobility is highly renowned in PvP, I won't speak on PvP as I am a PvE player, I will say that mobility is not a mandatory king to have in PvE content, especially depending on your builds in the game. You can absolutely get away with having low mobility. For example, in Assassin's Cal build, you basically have your variant of punch enemy, dodge to get your punch back, punch enemy again, rinse repeat on every single enemy, and you will just keep your dodge up permanently forever for as long as you keep your chain going. So in that situation, you do not need max mobility. You can get away with running something like 30. Of course, if you want to run more mobility, you can. That's totally up to you. But I just wanted to point out that it is not a mandatory thing to focus. Moving on to Strength, it's kind of in the same wheelhouse as mobility. It has its uses for Hunters in the game, but not quite mandatory status. Again, it has a loophole as well, where you can abuse your other abilities to get your melee back faster, in particular, your Gambler's Dodge, where you could use your melee, let's say, a Smoke Bomb on Void Hunters, or a Throwing Knife on Solar Hunters, and then you can use your dodge to get another knife back, and rinse repeat the process. Of course, if your build focuses on throwing your melee, and you're afraid of losing your dodge and not having access to your melee back, then you can spec into Strength if you'd like. Moving to intellect, I think intellect is not something you should really be focusing on. I do think that hunters have great supers, particularly in PvE, with Tether, Gathering Storm, Golden Gun, etc. But I think you have better utility to use your other abilities to get your super faster and abuse your mods, again, like Firepower, Heavy-Handed, Hands-On, and especially Reaper on hunters where you can dodge 24/7, particularly on Assassin's Cal builds, and activate Reaper non-stop over and over and over again to make Orbs of Power. You'll get your super back in no time. Finally, you have Discipline and Recovery. Now, both of these stats are highly valued, and I think you can't go wrong with picking either one for hunters. However, I will say it is dependent on which build you're using to see which one you want to pump up higher. For example, if I use my Retrofit Escapade Void Hunter with Gerfalcons, my recovery doesn't really mean much, because most of the time I will be activating Devour, I will be going camo, I will be shredding through enemies non-stop, and I will continuously be healing myself to full HP, meaning that the recovery stat means much less to me, and I'd rather have my resilience pumped and then my discipline pumped, because I want to abuse my grenade as much as possible, given that it's a weakening grenade, and also having weakened smoke bombs and having dodges and regen on my Devour as well for my grenade. On the flip side, if you're not doing a build like that, recovery could be very helpful for you, especially if you're going into a melee-based build and you want to have your health up as much as possible, as fast as possible. So in conclusion, you have a ton of different variables to use for hunters. Overall, number one will be Resil. Resil is king, as always. Following that up, it's a race between mobility, recovery, and discipline, depending on which kind of variant and build you want to use. You also have to depend on things like your dodge. So if you want to have your dodge up and get it back faster at all times, and you are not abusing your certain abilities to just have it up like an Assassin's Cal build, then you can spec in high mobility or leave it at mid-tier. And then the same thing goes for Discipline and Recov. Recov is great to have overall, so you can't go wrong with it, but Discipline, you have it great for certain builds and not so great and mid in other builds, so it will be dependent on what you want to use. For example, Void, I would definitely spec into Discipline, or on Solar, I definitely wouldn't spec to 100 Discipline. I would just leave it in mid-tier. And that is it for Stat Rambling the video. Once again, thank you for the support on the previous Solstice armor video, and hopefully this video as well helps you out on understanding what you should focus on in your armor stats, especially if you're a new player to the game. Outside of that, thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe. It does help the channel. Much appreciated. I have all my socials in the description below, as well as the video from the Solstice armor breakdown on stats. Twitter, YouTube, Discord, Twitch, all that, you know. Come over, say hi. All right, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Goodbye.